The story of the forest that should not exist. It was supposed to be a routine weekend getaway. A camping trip for 3 friends, Sarah, Daniel, and Mike. They'd chosen a remote spot near the edge of a national park. While unpacking, they noticed something unusual. A few hundred yards from their campsite stood a dense, sprawling forest. It wasn't on any map, and the park ranger hadn't mentioned it when they'd checked in. Curious, they decided to explore it before nightfall. As they stepped into the woods, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air grew thick with an eerie silence. No birds, no wind, no signs of life. The trees towered above them, their trunks unnaturally smooth, almost like stone. But the strangest thing was the ground. It was completely barren. No grass, no leaves, just hard, cracked earth. As they ventured deeper, they began to notice strange symbols carved into the trees, spirals, eyes, and shapes that seemed to twist unnaturally. Daniel, the most skeptical of the group, dismissed them as the work of some local prankster. But Sarah felt a deep unease creeping over her. An hour in, they realized something was wrong. The path they'd been following seemed to loop back on itself. Mike checked his phone for GPS, but the screen flickered and displayed a blank map. No signal. They decided to head back, but the forest had other plans. Every direction they turned, they were met with the same sight. The same trees, the same symbols, the same silence. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to shift when they weren't looking. The air grew colder, and a low hum began to resonate around them. "Maybe we're lost," Mike suggested, his voice shaking. But deep down, they all knew this wasn't normal. Suddenly, they heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't any of them. They froze, straining to listen. The whisper came again, this time closer. It seemed to come from all directions at once, a disjointed chorus of unintelligible words. Sarah grabbed Daniel's arm. "We need to get out of here now." They started running, not caring about direction anymore, just desperate to escape. The trees blurred together as they sprinted, the whispering growing louder, more insistent. Shapes began to move in the shadows, figures just at the edge of their vision. Mike, who was leading, stumbled and fell to the ground, crying out in pain. His ankle twisted, he couldn't move. Daniel and Sarah rushed to help, but before they could lift him, a figure emerged from the darkness. A tall, shadowy shape, its form vaguely human but wrong, twisted. It stood unnaturally still, its face obscured by a hood of darkness, as if it was part of the forest itself. The whispering stopped. Silence pressed in around them, thick and suffocating. The figure raised a long, gnarled hand and pointed at them. Without thinking, they grabbed Mike and pulled him to his feet. The shadowy figure did not move, but they could feel its presence pushing against their minds, filling them with a creeping dread. They ran, ignoring the pain, ignoring the burning in their lungs. The forest seemed to shift around them, twisting the paths, but somehow they burst through the trees and back into the clearing where they had set up camp. The sun had already set, but their tent was still there as if nothing had happened. Panting, they collapsed to the ground. When they looked back at the forest, it was gone. The dense woods they had just escaped had vanished, replaced by the empty field they had originally camped near. Breathing heavily, Sarah looked at Daniel and Mike, wide-eyed. That wasn't real, right?" Mike, pale and shaken, muttered. "It wasn't there, but we were inside it." The next morning, they packed up in silence, eager to leave. But before they drove off, Sarah glanced back at where the forest had been. For a brief moment, she swore she saw the shadowy figure standing at the tree line, watching. They never spoke about the forest again, but each of them, in their own way, would always feel the pull, the whisper of a place that should not exist, and a shadow that still waits, just out of sight. As the years passed, the memory of the forest lingered, gnawing at the edges of their minds. Sarah, Daniel, and Mike tried to move on, but the experience had left a deep scar on each of them. Sarah, the most sensitive to the eerie presence they had encountered, began experiencing strange dreams. In these dreams, she found herself standing at the edge of the forest again, except it was no longer distant. Each night, it seemed closer, encroaching upon her until, eventually, she stood inside its twisted confines. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, the whispering still ringing in her ears. Daniel, ever the skeptic, tried to rationalize what had happened. He threw himself into researching strange occurrences, local folklore, and uncharted forests. He scoured maps of the area, but no record of that woodland existed, not even from decades earlier. It was as if the forest had never been there at all, as if they had imagined the whole thing. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them out of the woods, something that wasn't done with them yet. Mike, the most deeply affected, became withdrawn. His ankle, which he had twisted during their frantic escape, healed physically, but his mind was haunted. He began seeing the figure in his peripheral vision, at first only in moments of stress or exhaustion, but soon it appeared more frequently. It would stand motionless in reflections or lurk in dark corners, always watching, never approaching. No one else could see it, and Mike felt like he was losing his grip on reality. One evening, several months after the incident, Sarah received a call from Daniel. His voice was strained, and she could hear panic lurking beneath his words. "I found something," he said, his breath quick. "You need to come to my place. Bring Mike. It's about the forest." Reluctantly, Sarah and Mike agreed. They hadn't spoken much since that night, and both had tried their best to bury the experience. But Daniel's urgency reignited the fear they had tried to suppress. When they arrived at Daniel's apartment, he greeted them with wild eyes and a stack of old books and papers spread across the table. "I've been digging," he explained. "This thing we found isn't unique. There are stories, old stories, of forests appearing out of nowhere, places that don't belong. People who wander into them and come back, changed." Sarah frowned, flipping through one of the dusty books. "But why haven't we heard of them before?" "Because no one survives long enough to talk about it," Daniel replied darkly. "Or if they do, they vanish soon after. The forest doesn't just disappear. It comes back for you." Mike paled. "What do you mean, it comes back for you?" Daniel pointed to a passage in one of the books. It was a journal, written in the 1800s by a man who claimed to have encountered a similar forest. The entry was fragmented, but one phrase stood out. "The forest finds you, no matter where you go. It calls, it watches, it waits." Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through Daniel's apartment. They all froze, exchanging terrified glances. "Who's that?" Sarah whispered. Daniel moved cautiously toward the door, but before he could open it, the knock came again, louder this time. It was insistent, rhythmic, almost unnatural. He peered through the peephole, but there was no one there. His hand trembled as he opened the door slightly, just a crack. Nothing. The hallway was empty. He turned back to the others. It's just..." The door slammed shut on its own, as if pushed by an unseen force. The lights in the apartment flickered, and the temperature plummeted. A familiar whisper began to fill the room, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. It was the same whisper they had heard in the forest. Mike backed away, clutching his head. No, it's here. It followed us." The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, and the air grew thick with dread. Sarah saw it first, standing just behind Daniel, the shadowy figure, the same one from the forest. Its hooded face was barely visible, but its presence was undeniable. It was no longer confined to the woods. It had come for them. "We need to leave," Sarah shouted, grabbing Daniel's arm. But the door wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed tight. The whispering grew louder, now a deafening roar, filling their heads with incomprehensible words. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, its gnarled hand reaching out. Desperate, Daniel grabbed one of the books and began flipping through its pages, searching for anything that might help them. His voice shook as he read aloud from a passage. "To escape the forest's reach, one must sever the bond. The forest takes what it is owed." "What does that mean?" Sarah cried, her voice rising in panic. The whispering paused, and for a moment, There was only silence. Then, the figure spoke, its voice a deep, unnatural rasp. "One of you must stay." The room seemed to tilt, reality warping around them. The figure's outstretched hand pointed at them, its hollow eyes locking onto Mike. "No," he whispered, backing away. "No, please." But the air thickened, the pressure growing unbearable. Sarah and Daniel could only watch in horror as the shadowy figure moved closer to Mike, its hand closing around him like a vice. And then, with a final, ear-splitting scream, Mike was gone. The room returned to normal, the temperature rising, the lights steady once more. The whispering had ceased, and the oppressive presence had vanished. But Mike was nowhere to be seen. Only an empty space remained where he had stood. Sarah and Daniel stood frozen, trembling with the weight of what had just happened. The forest had taken what it was owed. They knew that wherever the forest went, whatever it was still watching, waiting.